Lately, I've been very upset with my computer. It's been malfunctioning in all sorts of ways, preventing me from recording these lectures in a timely manner. But although I've been really upset, I haven't yet thought to myself, you know what I should do? I should give my computer a timeout and put it in the corner. Because it doesn't seem like it would make sense to hold a computer morally responsible for its behavior. And on the other hand, we tend to think that human beings are the sorts of things that it is correct to hold morally responsible for our behavior. If somebody does something horrible to us, we think it makes sense to hold that person accountable and punish or blame him. And we think that's the case because we tend to think that human beings have this quality of free will, whereas computers and maybe even animals don't have that quality. As we'll see in our discussion today, the conversation surrounding free will and moral responsibility gets very complicated very quickly. So to make it more easily digestible, today we're going to zoom in on free will and responsibility and talk about some of the definitions in the debate. So moving forward, we can have our conversations be more productive. All right, so first let's get some definitions out of the way. What do we mean by free will? We'll be defining it as the unique ability of persons to control their conduct in the fullest manner necessary for moral responsibility. Now, there are many things about this definition we should discuss. First, this says the unique ability of persons. Persons here is a technical term. It's not coextensive with human beings. There are some human beings who wouldn't qualify as persons in this definition because there are some human beings who don't have control over their behavior necessary for moral responsibility. Think of infants, right? If an infant happened to pick up some kind of weapon and accidentally horribly damage somebody, we wouldn't think it would be right to throw that infant in jail, right? Why? Because they don't yet have control over their conduct in a way that would make them an appropriate target of blame or punishment. They're just an infant. They don't have control over themselves yet. So there are some human beings who wouldn't qualify as persons on this definition. Furthermore, there might be some non-human beings who would meet the criteria of personhood that this definition trades on. So if there are very complex mammals might have the kind of control over their conduct necessary for moral responsibility. You might imagine a dog who's really well trained. If they do something that you think they should know better, maybe you would think them to be morally responsible, at least in some sort of way, for their behavior. So persons here does not mean all human beings. It means, but if somebody has this ability, if they have control over their conduct necessary for moral responsibility, then they'll qualify as a person. So free will is about control, controlling one's behavior. And in the philosophical literature, this idea is thought to be a necessary condition. So in order to have moral responsibility. So in order to have moral responsibility, you have to have enough control over your behavior. So our definition invoked this idea of moral responsibility. So let's talk about what we mean by that. Moral responsibility is just the status of being deserving of praise, blame, reward, and punishment. So if somebody's morally responsible for their actions, then if they do something good, they're deserving of praise, or really good, they're deserving of reward. And if they do something bad, they're deserving of blame for doing that bad thing. And if they do something really bad, then possibly punishment. So if you're deserving of those things, then you are morally responsible for your behavior, and you have met the conditions for moral responsibility, one of which is free will. Now, there are many threats to people's idea of freedom. There are many different types of freedom. There's political freedom, there's metaphysical freedom. The metaphysical freedom is what we're talking about here. So there are many threats to free will, and many threats to different kinds of ideas of freedom. So government oppression might be a threat to somebody's idea of political freedom, right? But the kind of freedom we're focusing on here is metaphysical freedom. So there's one threat that philosophers have taken to be central, or one that would be very damaging to our idea of ourselves as metaphysically free agents. And that's this idea of determinism. So determinism is the doctrine that every state of affairs, including every human event, act, and decision, is the inevitable consequence of prior states of affairs. So about the natural world, most people think this is the case, that the natural world operates according to natural laws, and given a certain state of affairs, if you knew what that was, and if you knew the laws that were operable, then what followed from that would be necessary. It would follow necessarily from the laws of nature and the given state of affairs, right? So, for example, if a weight hits a pool ball, then that pool ball is going to move, and it does that. Why? Because of the motion of the weight coming down and the laws of nature that get the pool ball moving. So we think things are like that in the natural world. Determinism says not only are things like that in the natural world, well, it recognizes that we're also part of the natural world. So our actions and decisions would be part of the natural world and governed by the same natural laws which govern the rest of nature, right? So the laws of cause and effect. So for any action, that action has, it's the inevitable consequence of prior states of affairs and the laws of nature. What determinism entails is what is up for grabs in the philosophical conversation about free will. We should note that there are many cases in our lives where we wonder if somebody's morally responsible for something that they've done. And this drama plays out in courts as well. So juries and judges sometimes wonder if individuals are morally responsible for their behavior. And sometimes there are things which might threaten their moral responsibility. So things like insanity, right? If somebody's insane, then we think they're not morally responsible for what they've done, or they're at least less morally responsible for what they've done. And that we have to judge on a case-by-case basis. So those are local threats to moral responsibility. Determinism, on the other hand, is thought of as a global threat to moral responsibility. So some philosophers believe that if determinism is the case, then people are not free. And if they're not free, then they're not morally responsible for their behavior. And this would go not just for certain cases, but all cases of moral responsibility. So some philosophers believe that determinism entails the lack of free will and moral responsibility for everyone. Not all philosophers, though. Some philosophers believe that every human action could be deterministic, and yet we're still free in a sense that's enough for moral responsibility. So whether determinism completely rules out free will is a matter of controversy. Something that's uncontroversially entailed by determinism is that given the past and the laws of nature, there is exactly one future. So for each event in the chain of events since the beginning of the universe, that event is causally determined, completely causally determined by prior states of affairs. So for every event moving forward, that event is completely causally determined by what came before it. So given the past and the laws of nature, that entails exactly one future according to determinism, and that is uncontroversial. Now, I find that when I tell students about this idea about determinism, many are very resistant to this idea that even human decisions follow with law-like regularity from previous states of affairs. So to get us to think about it, to make it sound a little more plausible, and to show you an example of an intuition that should lead us to think that even human actions could be deterministic, let's watch a clip from Back to the Future 2, and I'll talk about it. To set up this clip, Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, goes to the future. In the future, he sees in the window of the store a sports almanac that has the events of all sporting events leading up to that future time. So he thinks to himself, man, if I get this sports almanac, I could go back to the past, give it to my past self, and get rich. Instead, another character, Biff, who's an old man in that time, he hears about the sports almanac and he goes back to take it to himself in the past, and he manages to get to the past with Marty McFly in tow and try to give the sports almanac to his old self. Let's listen to their conversation.
It cost me $300! Will you shut up about the car? Hey, and another thing, how do you know where I live? Let's just say we're related. And that being the case, I got a little present for you. Something that'll make you rich. You want to be rich, don't you? Oh, yeah, sure, right. That's rich. You're going to make me rich? See this book? This book tells the future. It tells the results of every major sports event till the end of the century. Football, baseball, horse races, boxing. The information in here is worth millions. And I'm giving it to you. Well, that's very nice. Thank you very much. So why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? It's leave, you idiot. Make like a tree and leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong. All right then, leave. And take your book with you. Don't you get it? You could make a fortune with this book. Let me show you. UCLA Trail 17-16. It's 4th and 11 with only 18 seconds left in this game. I'd say it's all over for UCLA. Bet you $1 million UCLA wins at 19-7. What are you, deaf, old man? He just said it was over. You lost. Oh, yeah. Here comes Decker with a kick. It's up. It looks good, folks. It looks very good. Field goal. UCLA wins 19-17. Listen to that Coliseum crowd go wild. Jim Decker, senior head. All right, Pop, what's the gag? How did you know what the score was going to be? I told you, it's in this book. All you got to do is bet on the winner and you'll never lose.
All right, so there's the clip. And here's the thought experiment that this clip leads me to propose. Imagine you could go back to the past. And imagine you were in Biff's situation where you had a sports almanac and you were going to go give it to your past self and you were going to try to bet on all these games and get rich. But when you go back to the past, a weird thing happens. You're not able to interact with the world at all. You just see the world. And you see it playing out. Here's what I want to ask. How do you think the world would play out if you were able to go back to the past and just watch it play out? Do you think it would necessarily play out exactly the way it played out the first time? Now, you might think, well, now I'm in the past, so I might introduce some sort of cause that would have some butterfly effect that would change the way the world played out. But remember, in my thought experiment, you go back to the past, you're not able to interact with the world at all. You're just able to see it play out. how do you think it would play out? Would it necessarily play out exactly the way it played out the first time? So in this scenario in the clip, why should old Biff think that the coach in that sporting event will try to kick the field goal instead of, say, go for it on 4th down? Why would he think that? Well, he would think that because the same conditions were there and the same people and the way they thought about the conditions were there. So, of course, that will lead to the exact same decision. It'll be the same factors, the same deciders, the same decision-making processes, and the same outcome, right? Now, if you have that intuition like I do, then what you're saying is this world is deterministic. And even human actions are determined. They're determined by prior states of affairs, the way people think about things, and the way people think about things is determined by prior states of affairs, right? So prior states of affairs and events and the way people are thinking about them. And so if you have the same inputs, the same sort of machines, what would you expect? You'd expect the exact same outputs, right? So if you think that this is plausible, then you think that determinism is plausible. Now, if you think that now, if I go back to the past, somebody could make a different decision, then I'm not getting you on board with determinism. And we'll read some philosophers who are not totally on board with determinism. But when it comes to what my intuition would be, I think if I went back to the past and wasn't able to introduce any sort of new cause, but was just able to see what was happening, that the universe would play out exactly the same, no matter how many times I rewound it, right? Especially and necessarily if I wasn't able to introduce a new cause to change things. I guess another clip I could have played here was Groundhog Day, right? Now, in that movie, he's able to change things because he keeps coming back with new information, Bill Murray. But everybody else in that world just keeps playing out, taking the same actions they took every iteration of the day because they're the same initial conditions, they're thinking about things the same way, and that leads to the same results, right? All right, so maybe you're on board with me that our world is a deterministic world. Human actions, being part of that world, are also deterministic. If so, that leads to a potential problem about free will. So the full argument will go like this. It's called the Dilemma of Determinism. In order to be morally responsible, we thought we have to have free will. We have to have control over our behavior, right? Well, if determinism is true, and determinism, as I said before, uncontroversially entails that there's exactly one future. If determinism is true, there's exactly one future. Well, if that's the case, then it seems that we can never do otherwise than we actually do, meaning there are no alternative possibilities really open to us. And if that's the case, then it seems like we don't have free will. We're just fancy, very complex computers, right? So if determinism is true, exactly one future, that entails that we can never do otherwise than we do. And if we can't do otherwise than we do, then it seems like we don't have enough control over our behavior. So it seems in that world we wouldn't have moral responsibility for anything we do. Now here's a further issue. If determinism is not true, if on the other hand indeterminism is true, then some events, and if we're going to get any more, if there's even a possibility of getting moral responsibility out of this, human actions are random. So if indeterminism is true, then some events, and the ones we're worried about are human actions, they're either determined or they're indeterminate. If they're determined, no free will, no moral responsibility. If they're indeterminate, well, then they're random. And then they're not free in the sort of way we're talking about freedom. The kind of freedom we're talking about is control, right? It would be weird to say that we're in control over a random thing, right? Consider this thought experiment. Imagine instead of looking at your work for the semester, imagine I handed you a die, right? And I said, the grade that you're going to get will be determined by the result of this die roll. If you get a 1, you get an A. If you get a 2, you get a B. If you get a 3, you get a C. If you get a 4, you get a D. If you get a 5 or a 6, you get an F. You might justly complain that you're basing my grade on something that I'm not responsible for because it's a random thing, right? The result of a die roll, although when we talk about it more, is determined. Just the things that go into determining it make the outcome look like it's random, right? So you would justly accuse me of basing your grade on something you can't be morally responsible for because you have no control over it, right? Well, if human actions are like that, random in some sense, then it seems like we don't have the kind of control over them that we would need to have free will and moral responsibility. So either determinism or indeterminism is true. Either every event in our world is deterministic and follows with a law-like regularity from what came before it, or something or a number of things are not determined, in which case they're indeterminist, in which case indeterminism is true. But on either of those pictures, we don't have free will from 2 and 3. So therefore, it seems like whether determinism is true or not, we don't have free will. And if that's the case, then it seems we're not morally responsible for anything that we do. So this is a problem. We were talking about determinism as a potentially global threat to moral responsibility. But now it seems like indeterminism is also a global threat, in which case there's either way the universe is, we don't have free will and moral responsibility. So should we immediately start changing our practices? I mean, that would, on the face of it, change a lot of the way we act towards each other, right? Now, some philosophers will go all the way to the conclusion of this argument. They'll say, yep, all of this is right. We don't have free will and we don't have moral responsibility. Those philosophers are called hard determinists or sometimes hard incompatibilists. We'll stick with the term hard determinists. They think that because our actions are completely determined, we don't have free will, we don't have moral responsibility. Other philosophers will object at various points in this argument. The first set of disagreements that we'll talk about are from people who think we have libertarian free will. Here I'm using the word libertarian as they talked about in the crash course video. That's not political libertarianism, this is metaphysical libertarianism. A metaphysical libertarian could be an authoritarian communist, or they could be a political libertarian as well. Either way, right? The positions are not related. So a metaphysical libertarian would object to premise 3. They will say, even if indeterminism is true and human actions are in some sense random, we still have enough control over them in some sense in order to have moral responsibility. So they'll object to the truth of premise 3. Another group of philosophers that we'll look at are called Compatibilis, and they'll say premise 2 is false. They think determinism and free will are compatible, meaning can both be true at the same time. So even if determinism is true, there's either still a sense in which we can do other than we do, or doing other than we do is not necessary, so we have free will. They'll take one of those two strategies. So they say determinism and free will are compatible, so premise 2 here is false. So a little bit more about those positions. 2 questions on this chart. Do we have free will, and is free will compatible with determinism? In the bottom right-hand corner, we get the hard determinists, who will say we don't have free will because determinism is the case, and we can't have free will in a deterministic world. Now, a libertarian agrees with the hard determinists that you can't have free will in a deterministic world. But they'll say we do have free will because our actions are not determined. Those groups are both called incompatibilists. So libertarians and hard determinists are called incompatibilists because they think that free will and determinism are incompatible. The hard determinists say we don't have free will because of determinism. The libertarians say we can have free will because determinism is not the case. Either way, they think free will and determinism are incompatible. The compatibilists, on the other hand, say free will is compatible with determinism. They can both be true at the same time. An action can be completely determined, yet the actor can be morally responsible for it. And there are actions that are free enough to be that the actors are morally responsible for their actions. Now, there's no name for people who say free will is compatible with determinism, and yet we don't have free will. Usually, if somebody goes out of their way to argue that free will and determinism are compatible, they're trying to make a case that people can be responsible for their behavior. All right, so here's the definitions of those positions. Hard determinists believe that humans don't have free will because our actions are determined. Libertarians believe that humans have free will because our actions are not determined. Compatibilists think you can have both at the same time. All right, so in this lecture today, we defined some key terms in this debate. We defined free will as control over your behavior necessary for moral responsibility. We defined moral responsibility as being an appropriate target of praise, blame, reward, and punishment. We defined determinism as being, as saying that for every event, that event is the necessary cause of prior states of affairs and the laws of nature, and that determinism entails that we have exactly one future, and that's uncontroversial. Every philosopher in this discussion agrees with that. What philosophers don't agree on is whether determinism rules out free will. Libertarians and hard determinists say yes, it does. The libertarians say good thing that our actions aren't determined. The hard determinists say, unfortunately, our actions are determined, so we don't have free will. And the compatibilists say we can have both. Then we talked about we talked about the dilemma of determinism, how it seems that whether determinism or indeterminism is true, we don't have free will or moral responsibility. And then we talked about some ways that philosophers have objected to that argument, which gives us the positions on free will on the screen. So now we'll deal with, this just sets up the conversation for later, and the philosophers we're going to read. This week we're going to read some arguments from the hard determinists, then we'll read some arguments from a libertarian, and in the third week we'll read some arguments by compatibilists. So now for some quiz questions. Quiz question number 1. Determinism uncontroversially entails that A, there is no free will, B, there is only one possible future, or C, there is no moral responsibility. Which of those is uncontroversially entailed by determinism? Quiz question number 2. Libertarianism, metaphysical libertarianism, is the view that A, humans have no free will because their actions are determined, B, humans have free will even though their actions are determined, or C, humans have free will because their actions are undetermined. And quiz question number 3. Compatibilism is the view that A, humans have no free will because their actions are determined, B, humans have free will even though their actions are determined, or C, humans have free will because their actions are undetermined. Those are all the questions for our quiz. So thanks for sticking with this. I hope you have a better feel for free will, moral responsibility, and determinism, and the various positions in the debate. Next time, we'll start talking about some determinists.